My name is Frank Coleman. I'm 62 now, but I was 54 when this happened. For 35 years, I worked as a pipeline integrity technician, which is a fancy way of saying I walked, drove, and sometimes flew over thousands of miles of natural gas pipelines, mostly in the Pacific Northwest. My job was to look for trouble before it started: ground erosion, unauthorized digging, leaks, any little thing that could turn into a big, bad thing. It's a job that requires patience and a good eye for what's normal. You learn the land. You know the way a certain creek bank is supposed to look in April, and you know the sound the wind makes coming through a specific stand of Douglas fir. You get a feel for the baseline of a place, the rhythm of it. And you learn that the woods are full of strange noises and big animals. I've seen more bears, cougars, and moose than I can count. I've been bluff-charged, stalked for a mile by a cat I never saw, and had a bull moose tear the side mirror off my truck. None of it ever truly scared me. It was part of the job. It was explainable. What happened in the fall of 2016 in a stretch of timberland northeast of the Cascades was not. I'm telling this story now because my wife passed last year, and she was the only other person I ever told the whole truth to. She believed me. I don't expect you to, not really. But I have to put it on the record. I have to get it out of my own head, where it's been living and breathing for 8 years. Before I get into what happened, if you're new here, consider subscribing. I might have another story in me. I don't know. And drop a comment letting me know where you're watching from. I always like to know who's listening. All right, let me tell you what happened. The section of line I was inspecting was designated Alpha 9 or 7. It was a remote spur, about 12 miles of it cutting through dense national forest land that hadn't been logged in a century. Getting there was a chore. You'd take the main highway until it turned to a county road, then a Forest Service road, and finally a barely there access track that was more mud and road. My company truck, a Ford F-250, was built for it, but it was still a slow, bone-jarring crawl. It was mid-October. The air had that sharp, clean edge to it, the kind that promises a cold winter. The sky was what we call reluctantly sunny, a high, thin layer of gray gauze with a weak sun trying to burn through. It wasn't raining, but everything felt damp. The ground, the tree bark, the air itself. It was late afternoon, maybe 3 o'clock, and the light was already starting to fade, getting that thick, golden quality it gets when the sun is low and shining through a million tons of evergreen needles. My task for the day was simple. Walk the last 2-mile stretch of the right-of-way, from marker 112 to the terminus at 114, checking for any signs of subsidence on a particularly steep grade. The company had a new policy about walking these sections on foot instead of just doing a flyover after a small slip in another state went unnoticed for too long. So there I was. I parked the truck where the access track petered out, right by marker 112. The right-of-way itself is a strange thing to see in the middle of pristine wilderness. It's a corridor, about 50 feet wide, where all the trees have been cleared. It runs in a dead straight line, up and down hills, across streams, without any regard for the landscape. It's a scar, but a necessary one. The grass and low brush grow thick, and in the middle, you can usually see a faint path worn by maintenance crews and the animals that use it as a highway. The first thing I noticed was the quiet. Not silence exactly. That's a word people use when they don't know what real silence is. This was a lack of sound, a vacuum. Normally, that time of day, you'd hear squirrels chattering, jays screaming at each other, the rustle of small things in the undergrowth. There was none of that. The only noise was the wind, a low, sighing moan high up in the canopy on either side of the clearing, and the hum of the truck's engine as it cooled. I remember standing there for a full minute, just listening to the nothing. It was the kind of quiet that makes the hair on your arms stand up. It feels like pressure, like the whole forest is holding its breath, waiting for something. My brain, the practical 35 years on the job brain, started making excuses. A predator in the area, maybe a big cat. That'll shut the woods up right quick. Or maybe it was just the time of day, the change in weather. I shrugged it off, grabbed my pack with the water, rangefinder, and GPS unit, and started my walk. The grass was wet and tall, soaking my jeans to the knee almost immediately. The air smelled of damp earth, decaying leaves, and that unmistakable scent of pine resin. It's a smell I've always associated with peace, with being in my element. But that day it felt different. It felt heavy, oppressive. Every snap of a twig under my boots sounded like a gunshot in the stillness. I walked for about half a mile, my eyes scanning the ground, looking for the telltale cracks or slumps of shifting earth. Everything was normal. The pipeline markers were in place, the ground was stable, but the feeling of being watched was growing with every step. It's a cliché, I know. Everyone who tells a scary story says they felt like they were being watched. But this was a physical sensation, a prickling on my neck, a weight in the air behind me. A few times I stopped and turned around, quickly, hoping to catch a glimpse of whatever it was. A deer, a bear, even another person. But there was nothing. Just the long, empty green corridor stretching back toward my truck, with the dark, impenetrable walls of trees on either side. The trees themselves seemed wrong, looming, like they were leaning in over the clearing. I told myself I was being stupid, letting the quiet get to me. I'd been working alone for decades. It had never bothered me before. But I couldn't shake it. That's when I found the first track. It was in a patch of mud where a small spring seeped across the right-of-way. I almost missed it. I stopped to take a sip of water, and my boot slid a little. And when I looked down, there it was. It wasn't a bear track. I know bear tracks. A black bear track is almost human-like, with 5 distinct toe pads and claw marks. A grizzly track is bigger, with the toes in a straighter line. This was neither. It was huge, for one thing, at least 16 inches long. It was shaped like a dog's or a coyote's, but magnified to an impossible degree. A deep, canine-looking heel pad and 4 thick toes splayed out in front. But that wasn't the part that made my blood run cold. In the middle of the print, where the claws should have been, there were 5 deep, sharp punctures in the mud. Not the scraping marks of a bear's non-retractable claws. These were distinct, separate holes, driven straight down. Like someone had hammered 5 railroad spikes into the ground at the end of the toes. And the stride. I looked ahead and saw another one, about 8 feet away. Then another. It was bipedal. It was walking on 2 legs. My mind refused to accept it. It just wouldn't compute. My first thought, and I'm embarrassed to admit this, was that it was a prank. Some guy with a pair of novelty monster feet strapped to his boots, trying to scare people. It seemed absurd, but it was more plausible than the alternative. Who would be out here, in the middle of nowhere, doing that? And why? I followed the tracks for another 100 yards. They walked in a perfectly straight line, right down the center of the right-of-way, heading in the same direction I was. The stride was consistent, powerful. Each print was pressed deep into the soil, suggesting immense weight. I used my rangefinder to measure the distance between 3 of them. The average was just over 7.5 feet, a walking stride. I'm 6 feet tall, and if I stretch my legs as far as I can in a lunge, I can maybe cover 5 feet. This thing was covering 7.5 without apparent effort. The prank theory was starting to fall apart. The sheer weight required to make these impressions, the consistency, the remoteness of the location, it didn't add up. The unease I'd been feeling all afternoon began to curdle into real, solid fear. The quiet wasn't just quiet anymore, it was waiting. I stood there, over one of those impossible footprints, and I had a choice to make. Turn back, get in the truck, and drive away. Report what I saw and get laughed out of the regional office. Or keep going, finish my survey, be a professional. I chose the latter. It was the biggest mistake of my life. I told myself it was probably a bear walking weird, or some kind of geological anomaly. Anything but what my gut was screaming it was. I kept walking, but my focus was no longer on the pipeline. My head was on a swivel, my ears straining to catch any sound over the blood pounding in them. I was holding my breath without realizing it. The right-of-way ahead of me dipped down into a shallow gully where a seasonal creek ran, and then rose up a steep hill. The terminus marker, 114, was at the top of that hill. As I started down into the gully, the smell hit me. It was awful. A thick, gagging stench of wet dog, rotting meat, and something else. Something metallic and musky, like old blood. It was a predator smell, but it was 100 times stronger than any bear or cougar I've ever smelled. It clung to the damp air, so thick you could almost taste it. My hand went to the canister of bear spray on my belt. It felt pitifully small. The creek at the bottom of the gully was barely a trickle, just a ribbon of dark water moving through moss-covered rocks. The tracks went right through it and up the other side. As I climbed the muddy bank on the far side, I saw it. It was about 200 yards away, at the top of the hill, standing next to the yellow pipeline marker post. At first, my brain tried to file it under familiar. It was a man, a very tall man in some kind of fur coat. Then it moved, and my brain short-circuited. It wasn't a man. The sheer size of it was wrong. The pipeline marker next to it was 4 feet high. This thing towered over it. It had to be at least 8 feet tall, maybe more. It was standing with its back partially to me, looking out over the valley. Its profile was canine, a long, sloping muzzle, and tall, pointed ears that swiveled independently, scanning the landscape. The color was a matted, dirty gray-brown, like a wolf's winter coat. But it stood on 2 powerfully built legs that were bent backwards at the knee like a dog's. Its arms were long, too long for its body, and they hung down past its knees, ending in what looked like massive, clawed hands. It was covered in hair, but it wasn't uniform. It was patchy in places, showing glimpses of dark, leathery skin beneath. It was powerfully built, with a thick torso and broad, stooped shoulders. It was a nightmare. It was something that shouldn't exist, standing calmly in the fading afternoon light, as if it owned the whole damned mountain. I froze. Every muscle in my body locked up. I was standing halfway up the bank of the gully, partially hidden by a clump of ferns, but I felt as exposed as if I were on a brightly lit stage. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. All I could do was stare. My mind was scrambling, trying to find a box to put this in. Bear with mange, guy in a suit, optical illusion. None of it fit. The way it moved was the most unnatural thing. It wasn't stiff or clumsy like a person in a costume. It moved with a fluid, predatory grace. It shifted its weight from one foot to the other, and the muscles in its thighs bunched and relaxed under the matted fur. It turned its head, and the movement was sharp, bird-like. The long snout swept the air. It was sniffing. My heart, which had stopped, started again with a painful thud that I was sure it could hear from 200 yards away. The smell. It was coming from that thing. It must have caught my scent. That's when it turned and looked directly at me. I can't properly describe the feeling of being seen by that thing. It wasn't like being spotted by an animal. Animals look at you with instinct, with hunger or fear or curiosity. This was different. When its head snapped around and its eyes locked onto my position, I felt assessed, judged, like it was looking right through the ferns, right through my skull, and weighing my worth. The distance was too great to see its eyes clearly, but I felt them. I felt the intelligence behind them. It was ancient and cold and completely alien. For a few seconds, which felt like an eternity, we were locked in this tableau. Me, the frozen little man in the gully. It, the impossible monster on the hill. It didn't move. It didn't make a sound. It just stood there, watching me. Its head was slightly cocked, as if it were curious, as if it were trying to figure out what I was. And then, it did something that broke the spell of my paralysis. It raised one of its long arms and pointed, not at me but to the south, down the valley. It held the pose for a moment, one long clawed finger extended. Then it dropped its arm and took a single, deliberate step toward the edge of the hill, toward me. That was it. The connection broke. My survival instinct, buried under a mountain of disbelief and terror, finally kicked in. It was a purely reptilian brain function. There was no thought, no strategy. There was only one command: run. I turned and scrambled, sliding down the muddy bank into the creek bed. I didn't care about noise. I didn't care about falling. I splashed through the water and clawed my way up the other side, grabbing under roots and rocks to pull myself up. I didn't look back. I couldn't. I was afraid that if I looked back, I'd either see it right behind me or, worse, see that it was gone, and then not knowing where it went would be the end of me. I ran. I ran harder than I have ever run in my entire life. My lungs burned. My legs, 54-year-old legs that were used to walking, not sprinting, screamed in protest. The heavy, wet grass grabbed at my feet, trying to trip me. I just kept pumping my arms and legs, my eyes fixed on the hazy spot far up the corridor where I knew my truck was parked. Then I heard it. It wasn't a growl or a roar. It was a sound that had no business coming from a living throat. It was a high-pitched, chittering shriek that was somehow also a deep, guttural howl. It was a sound of pure rage and something else, something that sounded like metallic grinding. The sound echoed off the hills, and it did something to my nervous system. It was a predator's kill cry, and every cell in my body knew it was meant for me. That scream gave me a new burst of adrenaline. I risked a glance over my shoulder. It was coming. It wasn't running like a man. It was on all fours, covering the ground in huge, powerful leaps. It moved with the terrifying speed of a cheetah, its long limbs eating up the distance between us. It was a blur of brown fur and pumping legs. It had closed half the distance in seconds. I was a dead man. I knew it. There was no way I could outrun it. The truck was still so far away. My mind was a blizzard of panic. I remember thinking about my wife, about the stupid argument we had that morning over what to have for dinner. I remember the absurd thought that they'd find my boot, and that's all that would be left. I fumbled with the bear spray on my belt, my fingers clumsy and numb with cold and fear. I managed to pull it free, wrenching the safety clip off. I didn't even slow down. I just held it in my hand, a pathetic little can of pepper against a monster from the dawn of time. I could hear it now. I could hear the thud of its paws hitting the soft earth. I could hear its breathing, a harsh, rasping pant that sounded like a bellows. The smell was back, overwhelming me, making me gag as I ran. It was right behind me. I could feel its presence, a cold shadow falling over me. I braced myself for the impact, for the claws that would tear through my back. Without thinking, I spun around, still running backwards, and pressed the button on the can. A huge orange cloud of concentrated capsaicin erupted between us. I didn't wait to see if it hit. I didn't aim. I just sprayed and prayed, turning back and putting every last ounce of my strength into the final 100 feet to the truck. I heard a sound behind me, a choked-off howl of what sounded like surprise and pain, a series of wet, coughing snarls. It had worked, or at least, it had bought me a few precious seconds. I reached the truck, my hand slapping against the cold metal of the driver's side door. My keys. My keys were in my pocket. I jammed my hand into my jeans, my fingers shaking so badly I could barely close them around the small piece of metal. I found them, pulled them out, and tried to jab the key into the lock. I missed. I missed again. My fingers felt like sausages, completely useless. The coughing and snarling behind me had stopped. I risked another look. It was standing about 50 yards away, shaking its massive head from side to side. It was pawing at its face with one of its huge clawed hands. The bear spray had connected. It looked up, and even from that distance I could see its eyes. They weren't brown or black, they were glowing. A faint, self-illuminating yellow, like a cat's, but with no light source to reflect. And they were filled with a terrifying, reasoning hatred. It took a step toward me, a low growl rumbling in its chest. The key finally found the lock. I twisted it, threw the door open, and dove inside, pulling the heavy door shut behind me. I slammed the lock button down with the palm of my hand. The sound of the lock engaging was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard. I didn't waste a second. Key in the ignition. The engine turned over, the big diesel roaring to life. I jammed the truck into reverse, not even looking, and stomped on the gas. The truck lurched backwards, tires spinning in the mud, before catching and shooting back down the access track. I cranked the wheel, got it pointed in the right direction, and floored it. I didn't care about the suspension. I didn't care about the ruts. I just drove. In the rearview mirror, I saw it. It was standing in the middle of the right-of-way, where my truck had just been. It wasn't chasing me anymore. It was just standing there, watching me go. As my headlights cut through the gathering dusk, they illuminated it fully for a brief second. I saw the muzzle, stained dark with what looked like old blood. I saw the intelligence in those glowing yellow eyes, and I saw its chest heave, not with exertion, but with what looked like a deep, sighing breath. Then the truck bounced over a ridge, and it was gone. I didn't slow down until I hit the paved county road 5 miles later. My hands were shaking so hard I could barely keep the wheel straight. I pulled over, turned off the engine, and just sat there in the sudden silence, hyperventilating. I was covered in mud and sweat. I looked at my hands. They were white-knuckled, still clenched into fists. I opened them, slowly. In my right hand, I was still clutching the empty can of bear spray. I had held on to it the entire time. I drove home in a daze. I don't remember most of it. When I walked in the door, my wife Carol took one look at my face and knew something was terribly wrong. I was pale, shaking, and my eyes must have looked like dinner plates. I tried to tell her, but the words wouldn't come out right. They were a jumbled mess of bear and monster, and it was on 2 legs. She sat me down, made me a cup of hot, sweet tea,
and just let me babble until I started making something like sense. She never once looked at me like I was crazy. She just listened. The next morning, I called my supervisor. I told him a version of the truth.
I said I'd been charged by a very large, unusually aggressive bear. I told him I'd had to use my bear spray and had retreated, so I was unable to complete the survey of the last section of line. He was understanding. He told me to take the rest of the day off and to fill out an incident report. He asked if I was okay, if I needed to see a doctor. I said no, I was fine, just shaken up. But I knew I had to report it properly. Not the whole story, of course. They would have sent me for a psychiatric evaluation, but I had to tell someone. 2 days later, I drove to the county sheriff's office. I spoke to a deputy, a young guy who looked like he was barely out of his teens. I told him the same story I told my boss, but I added some of the details about the tracks. I described them as best I could, leaving out the part about them being bipedal. I just said they were huge, canine-like, and didn't look like any bear print I'd ever seen. He listened patiently, nodding and taking notes on a little pad. When I was done, he gave me a sympathetic, slightly condescending smile. He said it was almost certainly a grizzly. They weren't common in that part of the state, but they passed through from time to time. He said they could leave strange-looking tracks, and that a big male, surprised and angry, can seem like a monster. He told me I was lucky the bear spray worked. He took my name and number and said they'd have a fish and wildlife officer give me a call. The call came a week later. The officer was a woman who sounded tired and overworked. I went through the story again. She asked a few pointed questions. How big was it? What color? What did its face look like? I described what I had seen, censoring the most impossible parts. I said it was huge, dark-colored, and that its face was long, like a dog's. I emphasized the tracks. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "Mr. Coleman," she said finally, her voice flat, "what you're describing is a bear. Probably a black bear with cinnamon coloration, which people mistake for a grizzly all the time. They're big, they're scary, and when they stand up on their hind legs, they can look surprisingly human." I tried to interject, to tell her it wasn't standing up for a moment. It was walking, living on 2 legs. But I stopped myself. What was the point? She had already made up her mind. "As for the tracks," she continued, "mud does funny things. A paw can slip, a double print can look like one big one. There are a dozen rational explanations. We'll file a report about an aggressive bear in that area, but frankly, we don't have the manpower to go searching for it unless it attacks livestock or a person." And that was it. Case closed. An aggressive bear. A trick of the light. Slippery mud. I knew what I had seen, but the world, the official world, had no room for it. It was easier to file me under spooked hiker and file the creature under unusual bear. I felt completely alone. Only Carol knew the whole story, and while she believed me, she couldn't understand the depth of the terror. It changed me. I finished out my career with the company, another 6 years, but I was never the same. I refused to work remote sections alone anymore. I'd make any excuse. I'd call in sick. I took a pay cut to get a more junior partner assigned to me. My bosses thought it was strange, this sudden loss of nerve in their most experienced field technician. But they chalked it up to my age. They thought the bear attack had just gotten to me. Every time I had to go into the woods, I was on edge. Every shadow was a threat. Every snapping twig sent a jolt of ice through my veins. The peace I used to find in the wild was gone, replaced by a constant, humming dread. The forest was no longer a place of solitude. It was a place where things hid. I started doing research, late at night, when Carol was asleep. I'd type phrases into the computer that I was ashamed of. Dog-headed man, Washington State monster, giant wolf creature. And I found things.
I found stories, hundreds of them, from all over the country, all over the world. People describing the same thing. 8 feet tall, canine head, backward bent legs, glowing eyes. The impossible creature I had seen had a name. They called it a Dogman. The stories were all dismissed as folklore, as misidentification, as hoaxes. But they were also terrifyingly consistent. The details matched. The smell, the sounds, the feeling of malevolent intelligence. Reading those accounts was both a comfort and a terror. A comfort to know I wasn't the only one, that I wasn't crazy. And a terror to realize that this thing, this species or whatever it is, was real, and it was out there. And it was a secret the world was determined to keep from itself.
I've never been back to Alpha 9 or 7. The company retired that spur line a few years after my encounter, rerouting the gas through a main trunk line. As far as I know, that access track is overgrown, the right-of-way slowly being reclaimed by the forest. Sometimes, late at night, I think about that thing. I think about it pointing. It wasn't pointing at me. It was pointing south, down the valley. What was it trying to tell me? Was it a warning? A territorial display? Or was it something more? An attempt to communicate in the only way it knew how. The intelligence is the part that haunts me the most. This wasn't a dumb beast. It assessed me. It decided I wasn't a threat, or maybe not worth the effort. It pursued me only after I ran, like a predator whose prey drive has been triggered. But then it stopped. It watched me drive away. It chose to let me go. Why? I'll never know. I'll go to my grave not knowing. What I do know is that we live on a planet we think we understand, a world we've mapped and cataloged and tamed. But there are still deep woods and dark places where the maps are wrong, where the rules of biology and evolution don't seem to apply. And there are things in those places that have been there for a very, very long time, living in the shadows, watching us. We are not the apex predators we think we are. We are just the ones who build the brightest fires. I'm telling you this because you need to know. When you're out in the wilderness and the woods go quiet and you get that feeling on the back of your neck, don't ignore it. Don't rationalize it away. Your ancestors survived because they listened to that feeling. It's a warning. It means you've been seen. Turn around and walk away. Don't run. Just leave. Because you don't want to see what's watching you. You don't want to look into its eyes. Some things, once seen, can never be unseen. And the world is never ever the same again. It's bigger and older and much, much scarier than you can possibly imagine.